To think like a speculator, you must learn to think against yourself. That's the paradox Jesse Livermore lived by, the man who became a millionaire before most people learned what a stock was, and who understood the market in a way few ever would. Trading isn't about predicting what will happen, it's about thinking clearly when no one else can. To think like a speculator is to separate your logic from your emotion, your judgment from your desire, and your discipline from your fear. But that's not easy, because every trade you make is a test, not of your strategy, but of your mind. And the market? It's the world's greatest mirror. It reflects your weaknesses, magnifies your impulses, and amplifies every whisper of greed and panic inside you. Livermore once said, "A speculator must have no loyalty, not to opinions, not to hope, not to fear." Think about that for a second. No loyalty, not even to your own analysis. Because the moment you grow attached to a position, a bias, a belief, the market has already found your weakness. And in Livermore's world, weakness was fatal. When we think of trading, we think of data, charts, setups. But Livermore knew those were only surface tools. The real game was played inside the mind, in silence, before every click, in the space between knowing and doing. To think like a speculator is to think without comfort. You must learn to welcome uncertainty, to thrive in contradiction, to act when logic demands it, but emotion resists. It's not natural, it's not easy, but it's necessary. That's what Livermore meant by being cold-blooded. Not cruel, not careless, but calm, detached, ruthlessly rational in a world driven by panic. And yet, even he, the greatest of his time, admitted that this discipline didn't come from brilliance, it came from pain. Because markets don't reward intelligence, they reward emotional control. Every fortune Livermore made was born from discipline, every loss from the moment emotion took the wheel. So tonight, we'll go deep into the mind of a speculator, not the myth, not the legend, but the man who built a formula for decision-making that still guides traders over a century later. We'll uncover how he thought, how he reacted, and how he taught himself to see clearly when everyone else was blind. Because if you can master the way Livermore thought, not what he traded, but how he thought, you'll understand the true secret of success in the markets. So let me ask you, when you're faced with a decision to enter, to hold, to exit, do you act from logic or emotion? Comment below, because the way you answer that question defines what kind of trader you are. Next, we'll step into the paradox, the inner conflict that every speculator must confront, how to remain rational in an irrational world. The first rule of speculation isn't to buy or sell, it's to stay sane while everyone else loses their mind. That's the paradox, because the market doesn't demand intelligence, it demands clarity. And clarity, Livermore knew, only exists when you've killed your need to be right. Every trader, every speculator fights this war, the war between conviction and flexibility, between belief and evidence. We want certainty in an uncertain world. We crave control in a game built on chaos. But Livermore understood that certainty doesn't exist, only probability does. And he built his entire mindset around that truth. He once said, "There is only one side to the market, and it is not the bull side or the bear side, but the right side." To him, the right side wasn't moral, emotional, or ideological. It was mathematical. It was where logic lived, detached, cold, impersonal. But that's the hardest place for a human being to operate from, because humans aren't machines, we feel. And speculation is the one arena that feeds those feelings with constant feedback. Every tick makes you feel smarter or dumber. Every candle stokes hope or fear. You're never neutral, and that's the trap. Livermore knew that the market's greatest weapon wasn't volatility, it was suggestion. Every price move whispers something seductive. Buy now before it runs. Sell now before it crashes. Act now before it's too late. And every one of those whispers is emotion in disguise. The speculator's job, the real job, is to filter truth from temptation. But that's where the paradox deepens. To succeed, you must have convictions strong enough to hold your ground, yet flexible enough to abandon it instantly when the market proves you wrong. That balance is the razor's edge. Too rigid, and you die by pride. Too loose, and you die by panic. Livermore lived on that edge. He built his discipline not around being right, but around being fluid. He didn't predict, he observed. He didn't react to price, he listened to behavior. He watched how markets moved, not what people said they would do. And yet, he wasn't immune to the same conflict every trader faces, the voice that says, "I know I'm right, the market is wrong." That voice is deadly, because the moment you believe the market is wrong, you stop learning, you stop adapting, you stop surviving. Livermore believed that a speculator must think like a scientist, emotionless, curious, analytical. He said, "I never argue with the tape, the market is always right." That's not surrender, that's wisdom. Because the tape isn't judging you, it's teaching you. But to learn, you must be willing to think against yourself, to challenge your own comfort, your own ego, your own beliefs. That's what Livermore called the mental furnace. Every great trader walks into it, and most never walk out. You see, speculation isn't about predicting others, it's about mastering yourself among others. You're surrounded by fear, greed, euphoria, and you must think clearly while everyone else is drowning in noise. That's not intellect, that's emotional composure, the discipline of detachment. Livermore used to say the market was like the ocean. You can't fight the tide, you can only learn to ride it. The moment you try to control it, you drown. So, trader to trader, I'll ask you this. When you're right and the market disagrees, do you wait or do you adjust? Comment your truth below, because that moment reveals whether you think like a speculator or just trade like a gambler. In the next section, we'll uncover the trap, the mental flaw that turns smart traders into emotional victims, the one mistake Livermore saw destroy more fortunes than bad analysis ever could. Most traders don't lose because they lack knowledge. They lose because they refuse to think like speculators. That's the trap. Not ignorance, attachment. Attachment to opinions, attachment to predictions, attachment to being right. Every trader begins with analysis, logic, structure, order. But the moment money's on the line, something primal awakens. You stop seeing probabilities and start seeing identity. Now, every trade isn't just a position, it's a reflection of your worth, your intelligence, your self-belief. And when that identity is threatened, emotion takes control. Livermore called it the invisible disease. He said, "The market never cares what I think, but I always cared too much." That's the heart of the problem. We think we're analyzing data, but we're really defending ego. The speculator's trap isn't fear or greed alone, it's the illusion of control. You want the market to behave. You want it to reward your insight, confirm your conviction, validate your worth. But the market is indifferent. It exists beyond you. Livermore learned this the hardest way possible. He'd spot the perfect pattern, build conviction, and enter heavy. Then the tape would twist, grind, and punish him for believing too strongly. He realized that being right too early felt the same as being wrong, and the market didn't distinguish between the two. He wrote, "The moment I married a position, I signed my own death warrant." That's a chilling truth, because when you fall in love with a trade, you stop being a speculator, you become a believer. And belief is poison in the world of uncertainty. Believers hold losing positions because it will come back. Believers ignore evidence because I know I'm right. Believers pray to the market instead of reading it. Speculators, on the other hand, do something colder. They divorce their opinions the moment price disagrees. They cut the line. They detach. They survive. That detachment, that mental flexibility, is what Livermore called cold-bloodedness. He didn't mean cruelty, he meant the ability to remain emotionally dead to outcome. Because the market isn't a moral story, it's a math problem. And math doesn't care if you're hopeful. But that's the problem. We're human. We crave story, we crave meaning, and the market seduces us with both, until we forget its chaos dressed in data. Livermore wrote that his worst losses didn't come from bad setups, but from good ideas he couldn't let go of. He called it the paralysis of conviction. He'd enter a trade with perfect logic and stay in it out of pride. Because the same conviction that creates great winners also builds the tomb for every trader who refuses to change their mind. That's the psychological trap. You begin trading to prove something, to the market, to others, to yourself. And the more you need to prove, the less you can see. That's why Livermore built a simple rule that he never broke after losing millions. Never argue with the tape. If the price action says you're wrong, you're wrong. No debate, no defense, no emotion. It sounds easy in theory, but in practice, it's brutal, because the hardest thing in trading isn't cutting losses, it's cutting beliefs. That's why the market humbles everyone eventually. It doesn't punish ignorance, it punishes arrogance. The moment you think you know, you stop listening. Livermore once joked that the market was a mirror held by God himself to remind man how small he truly is. And when he said that, he wasn't being poetic, he was being honest. Because the real trap isn't in your charts, it's in your mind. So let me ask you, how many times have you stayed in a trade not because it made sense, but because you didn't want to admit you were wrong? Be honest, comment below. Because in the next section, we'll explore how Jesse Livermore escaped this trap, how he rewired his thinking to make cold-blooded decisions in the heat of chaos. Speculation is not a game of prediction, it's a game of observation. That's how Jesse Livermore saw it. He didn't think of himself as a gambler or even as a trader. He thought of himself as an observer of human nature through the language of price. And that perspective, that shift from participation to observation, was his escape from the emotional trap that ruins most traders. Livermore knew the human mind was wired to react, to pain, to gain, to the sight of red or green. But he also knew that every reaction was predictable, and the market, being the collective sum of human reaction, moved in patterns of psychology, not prophecy. He said Wall Street never changes because human nature never changes. That was his revelation. You don't have to predict the market. You just have to understand how people behave when they're afraid, greedy, or euphoric. And that starts by learning to think like no one else. Livermore realized that while most traders think emotionally and act impulsively, the successful speculator must think probabilistically and act mechanically. He must operate as if he were a surgeon, cold, precise, detached, making the necessary cut without hesitation, without sentiment. He wrote, "It was never my thinking that made the big money, it was my sitting." But that sitting wasn't passivity, it was the discipline of non-interference. Livermore called it waiting for the line of least resistance. It meant he didn't force trades. He waited until the market aligned perfectly with his method, until both logic and behavior pointed in the same direction. He didn't chase, he didn't hope. He simply waited and then struck with total conviction, free of noise, free of emotion. That's how he trained his mind. He replaced emotional instinct with mental rehearsal. Every trade became a hypothesis, every loss a data point. He never fought the tape, because fighting price was fighting truth itself. That's why Livermore believed a speculator's greatest tool was self-observation. He spent more time analyzing his own reactions than market movements. He wrote detailed journals, not about setups, but about how he felt during wins and losses. He documented fear, greed, hesitation, and slowly, he learned his own tendencies better than any system could. Livermore said, "After losing millions, I realized it wasn't the market that had to change, it was me." He turned his attention inward. He saw that his downfall always began the same way: a flicker of ego, a moment of hope, a refusal to accept what was in front of him. So he designed his formula for cold-blooded decisions. It wasn't mathematical, it was psychological. Detach from every trade emotionally. Treat it as data, not destiny. Let the market confirm your idea, don't try to confirm it yourself. He waited for confirmation of movement, not just conviction of thought. Always act in harmony with momentum, never against it. The line of least resistance is where truth lies, he wrote. Cut what doesn't work, instantly, without thought. The market is never wrong, opinions are. Sit tight when right and do nothing. Discipline is not acting when you most want to. That was Livermore's system, not a trading method, but a mental philosophy. He didn't just manage trades, he managed himself. He believed the true edge wasn't timing, information, or analysis. It was emotional neutrality, the ability to think without bias, decide without hesitation, and act without attachment. Livermore called that state the speculator's calm, a place of internal stillness amid external chaos. It wasn't natural, it was trained, forged by failure, repetition, and radical self-honesty. He once said that to think like a speculator, you must think against the crowd, against your emotion, and sometimes even against yourself. Because the market will always tempt you with illusion, of control, of certainty, of safety. But Livermore learned that true safety lies only in discipline. He didn't conquer the market by fighting others, he conquered it by mastering his own reactions. That was his formula. That was his legacy. So I'll ask you, when you make decisions, do you act as an observer or as a participant? Do you execute your plan or defend your ego? Comment below, because that distinction, that subtle shift, determines who survives this game. Next, we'll step into the story of a modern trader, one who tried to follow Livermore's formula, but discovered that thinking like a speculator requires something even harder than discipline. Every trader believes they're rational, until the market proves otherwise. Let me tell you a story. It's about a trader named Daniel. Not a beginner, not a reckless gambler, but a disciplined, methodical professional who'd spent years studying market behavior, building systems, testing theories. He admired Jesse Livermore, read reminiscences of a stock operator twice a year. He prided himself on being calm, controlled, cold-blooded. But like every trader before him, there came a moment when the market showed him who he really was. It started with a perfect setup, one he'd been stalking for weeks. A major breakout pattern forming on a stock everyone was watching. Volume rising, price coiling, everything lined up like clockwork. He entered, confident, calculated, and for the first 2 hours it moved perfectly, just as he planned. Then, a sudden drop, a sharp reversal, no news, no warning, just pain. He looked at his screen, watched profits vanish, then turn red. And that's when the two voices came. One whispered, "It'll bounce, it always does." The other screamed, "Get out before it's worse." Hope and fear, the eternal duel. He froze, because Livermore's voice, the one from the pages of his journals, echoed in his head. The market is never wrong. Opinions often are. He knew what he should do, cut the loss. But his pride hesitated. He told himself he'd wait for confirmation, a small bounce, a sign, something. Minutes passed, then hours, and with every tick lower, his heart beat faster, his breathing shallower. The logical Daniel, the disciplined Daniel, disappeared. All that remained was emotion. He adjusted his stop, then removed it entirely. He told himself, "I'll just watch. It'll turn." But it didn't. That night, as the candles bled red across his screen, Daniel realized something devastating. He hadn't been trading the market. He'd been trading his belief in himself. And that belief, that ego, blinded him to the one truth every speculator must face. You don't trade to be right. You trade to survive. He closed the trade the next morning, a 12% loss. Not catastrophic, but costly. Yet what stung most wasn't the money. It was knowing that he had broken his own rules, the very rules he thought defined him. He sat at his desk for hours, motionless. No charts, no data, just silence. And in that silence, Livermore's words came back. A man must study his own mistakes, for they are his greatest teachers. So he did. For the next week, Daniel reviewed his trades. Not the technicals, but the psychology. He wrote down every thought, every hesitation, every emotional flicker. He discovered that his downfall began not when price reversed, but when his ego refused to. He realized he'd entered the trade wanting to prove he was right, not wanting to read the truth. And in that need for certainty, he lost sight of his only job, to stay objective. That moment changed him. He rewired his process. He stopped journaling trades by setup type and started journaling by emotional state. He'd rate every trade from 1 to 10, not for profit, but for mental detachment. He called it his Livermore score. If he entered with bias, that was a 3. If he entered with clarity, that was a 10. And slowly, something shifted. He began to see what Livermore meant when he said, "Speculation is not about anticipation, it's about reaction." Daniel stopped predicting. He started responding, not emotionally, but scientifically. And within months, his entire trading rhythm changed. He didn't win every trade, far from it, but he stopped fighting the market. He stopped fighting himself. That's when he understood what Livermore really meant by thinking like a speculator. It wasn't about detachment from money, it was about detachment from identity. To be able to say, "I was wrong," without shame. To cut losses without hesitation. To act without emotional permission. And that's the day Daniel stopped being a trader and became a speculator. In the next section, we'll step into the emotional low point, the breaking moment where Livermore's philosophy meets reality, and why every trader must lose their illusions before they can ever gain true control. Before we move forward, tell me in the comments, have you ever broken your own trading rule, even though you knew better? Be honest, because that's where growth begins. Every speculator eventually faces the moment that tests everything, not their strategy, but their soul. For Jesse Livermore, that moment came more than once. Each time, it looked different: a market crash, a failed campaign, a sudden reversal, but it felt the same. A quiet, suffocating awareness that all the brilliance, all the charts, all the discipline in the world meant nothing without self-control. After one of his greatest losses, Livermore walked out of his New York office, down through the mist of evening traffic, hands buried in his coat pockets. He didn't rage, he didn't blame. He just walked, one step at a time, through a world that suddenly seemed louder, harsher, colder. He later wrote that during those times, he didn't lose money, he lost confidence. And without confidence, a trader is paralyzed, because the hardest trade to take is the next one after defeat. That's what happened to Daniel too, our modern trader. After his big loss, something inside him cracked. He stopped trusting his system. He'd stare at charts for hours, second-guessing every entry, deleting orders, rewriting notes. He wasn't afraid of losing money. He was afraid of being wrong again. And that's the silent death of a trader, fear disguised as caution. Livermore knew that trap intimately. He said, "There is nothing new on Wall Street. There can't be, because speculation is as old as the hills. Whatever happens in the market today has happened before and will happen again." When he wrote that, he wasn't talking about price patterns, he was talking about human emotion. Because every trader who has ever existed eventually hits the same wall. They mistake being wrong for being worthless. And when that happens, they stop trading to win, they start trading to feel safe. Livermore once compared the market to an ocean. He said that trying to force a trade was like trying to command the tide. You can't. You can only observe it, respect it, and move with it when it turns. That was his breakthrough, and Daniel's too. Because the turning point didn't come from victory, it came from surrender. One night, Daniel sat alone in his office. No charts, no noise, just stillness. He opened Livermore's old journal again and found a single underlined line. The only thing to do when a man is wrong is to be right by ceasing to be wrong. He read it twice, then again, and something clicked. He realized he'd been fighting to rebuild his confidence when what he really needed was to rebuild his trust in objectivity. He didn't need to believe in himself, he needed to believe in his process. He didn't need motivation, he needed detachment. That's when everything shifted. He began to see losses differently, not as failures, but as feedback. Every mistake became a message, a signal pointing to the flaw in his thinking. He stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and started asking, "What is this teaching me?" Livermore did the same. After every collapse, he would retreat, not to escape the market, but to study his reactions. He treated each emotional breakdown like a postmortem. Because to think like a speculator, you must first see your emotions as data. And that realization, that your feelings are indicators, becomes the beginning of emotional mastery. Daniel returned to his trading desk weeks later. The market hadn't changed, but he had. His mind was quieter, his focus sharper. He no longer felt the need to be right, only to be realistic. He began following his system again, not mechanically, but consciously. He didn't chase, he didn't flinch, and when trades failed, he smiled, because he saw what Livermore saw, that being wrong isn't painful when your identity isn't attached to outcome. That's the paradox of growth. The moment you stop resisting pain, you stop suffering. The moment you accept uncertainty, you gain control. For Livermore, that was the rebirth. For Daniel, it was the same. For you, maybe it starts right here. Because every trader at some point must be broken down by the market, not to be destroyed, but to be refined. That's when speculation stops being about money and becomes a path to self-mastery. Next, we reach the final section, Livermore's cinematic conclusion, the cold truth about thinking like a speculator, and the one question every trader must answer before the next trade. Before we move there, I want to ask you, have you ever hit that wall where you questioned if you could keep going? Comment below, because your turning point might inspire someone else's comeback. The goal of every speculator is not to conquer the market, it's to conquer himself. That's where Jesse Livermore arrived after a lifetime of fortune and failure, triumph and despair. He understood what most traders never realize: the real profit isn't money, it's mastery. Livermore didn't survive the market because he was the smartest man on Wall Street. He survived because he was willing to think in ways others couldn't and feel in ways others refused to. He learned that in speculation, there are no certainties, only conditions, no enemies, only emotions, and no real victories, only clarity. To think like a speculator is to stand in the middle of chaos and remain still. It's to see opportunity not as excitement, but as data. It's to face loss not as tragedy, but as tuition. He once said, "A man must always remember that he cannot fight the market. The market is not a foe, it is merely a reflection of human nature, and that's the final truth." Because when you strip away the charts, the headlines, the opinions, the market is nothing more than a mirror. It shows you who you are, every hesitation, every burst of greed, every flicker of fear. When you learn to read that reflection without judgment, you stop trading against the market and start trading with it. Livermore believed a true speculator must be cold-blooded, not because he lacks emotion, but because he refuses to let emotion decide. He must think in probabilities, not promises. He must trust his process more than his predictions. He must, above all, respect uncertainty because it's the only constant that never lies. Daniel, our modern trader, finally understood this. He stopped asking, "What will the market do next?" and started asking, "How will I behave when it does?" That's when he became something different, not a gambler, not a strategist, but a speculator, one who operates from awareness, not emotion. And you, listening now, you've walked the same path. You've felt the thrill of a perfect entry, the sting of a brutal reversal, the shame of ignoring your plan. But you're still here, and that means something, because awareness is the beginning of transformation. Livermore's life wasn't a story of victory, it was a story of evolution. He taught us that in the market, as in life, discipline is freedom, patience is power, and humility is survival. To think like a speculator is to live by one principle: do not seek to be right, seek to stay in the game. Because those who last win. So, as the markets open tomorrow and your screen lights up once again, ask yourself, are you thinking like a trader or like a speculator? Are you reacting to emotion or responding to truth? And maybe the most important question of all, when the next decision comes, will it be made by your ego or by your discipline? Because the market doesn't care about your hopes. It doesn't respect your fear. It only rewards those who think clearly, act decisively, and move without hesitation. And that's not luck. That's not genius. That's the discipline game. If this film resonated with you, comment below, "I choose discipline." Let's fill the comments with conviction, because in the end, this isn't about trading the market. It's about mastering the mind behind the trade.